The United States, a country once termed the Great American Melting Pot, has a long history of racism, specifically visible in its immigration policy. Racial exclusion has always played a huge part in immigration regulation. While some policies appear neutral, they actually influence the prejudice system in which our country was built upon. Immigration policy is a hot topic currently, and the average person is more informed than ever before. I intend to explore major occurrences throughout the history of this country up until the early 2000s that showcase patterns in our immigration policy that has caused it to be implicitly racist today. There is much debate whether our country should follow a colorblind or color-conscious society. While some argue that a colorblind society encourages equality, others counteract that logic, saying it refuses to address the past, therefore making people ignorant to racial issues that are still present. Because race relations have improved, people believe we are entering in a post-racial society. In Colorblind White Dominance by Ian Haney Lopez, he writes that race as we understood and practiced in the United States will change rapidly over the next few decades. Lopez sees us moving towards a hierarchy of colorblind white dominance. The elements of this colorblind white dominance includes continued racial dominance by whites, an expansion of who counts as white along socio-racial rather than bioracial lines, and a colorblind ideology that simultaneously proclaims a robust commitment to anti-racism, yet works assiduously to prevent effective racial remediation. By analyzing the history of immigration policy, it has been revealed that we were once blatant in our exclusion of those not white, but now we exclude the same people, but appear to act subtle. Our idea of who is excluded and not excluded still has skin color attached to it, but it also extensively depends on economic class. Lastly, our colorblind culture creates barriers to ending racism rather than alleviating the years of barring certain groups. Studying the evolution of immigration in the United States confirms the idea that racism has become quieter, but it is still very much alive. Only 14 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person who had been in the United States for 2 years. This left out Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, free blacks, and later Asians. These were the first rules set forth for granting national citizenship. The Naturalization Act was repealed once in 1795 and again in 1798. Both of these became laws to extend the length that a free white person of good character had to live in the United States before obtaining citizenship. During the colonial era, naturalization laws were passed to encourage immigration. Offering equal privileges worked as a strategy to get foreigners to come to the New World for work. After the American Revolution, America became more exclusionary. The Naturalization Act of 1790 set a precedent for our country's attitude on immigration. Our founding fathers yielded decisions on naturalization to Congress. This established a long-standing standard for citizenship of children born outside of the United States whose parents were citizens. In 1850, the California legislature passed the Foreign Miners Tax, which required Chinese and Latin American gold miners to pay a special tax on their holdings, a tax not required of European American miners. This tax at $20 a month was imposed only on foreign miners, and this tax was justified by the fact that these miners were not citizens. In 1882, Congress prohibits Chinese immigration for 10 years, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act banned all Chinese labor immigration in the United States and also put new requirements on Chinese who had already entered the country. If they chose to leave the United States, it became a lengthy process to enter back in. This included new certifications. State and federal courts were refused the right to grant citizenship to Chinese aliens, but they had the power to deport them if necessary. While this law was meant to not allow laborers, it became prevalent that it was incredibly difficult for Chinese immigrants to prove that they were not laborers. Even after the 10 years, Chinese immigration was carefully regulated and later banned in 1902 until 1943. The Chinese Exclusion Act became the first law passed that prevented all members of a specific ethnic or national group of immigration from entering a country. During this period, we saw the first examples of commercial human smuggling, which has since expanded and is modernly used. In 1897, a federal district court in Texas narrowly upholds the right of Mexicans to naturalize citizenship under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, holding Mexicans be white persons for purposes of naturalization. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848 and officially ended the Mexican-American War. The United States gained an additional 25,000 square miles to the United States territory, including the land that makes up portions of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. In return for this, the United States paid Mexico $15 million. In 1896, a man named Ricardo Rodriguez applied for the United States citizenship in San Antonio, Texas. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Texas was annexed and independent from Mexico, so Rodriguez did not qualify for the American citizenship due to the federal statute that ruled only Caucasians and Africans could become United States citizens. While the statute stated this, it did not deny Mexicans from obtaining citizenship. Therefore, this initiated a case involving the naturalization of Mexicans and their right to vote in the state of Texas. In 1897, a judge ruled in favor of Rodriguez and set a precedent for Mexican citizenship in Texas. This ruling confirmed that neither race nor special levels of education could be sued to deny United States citizenship to anyone. While this law benefited Mexicans by allowing them immigration rights into Texas, they were essentially stripped of an identity by identifying them as white for purposes of naturalization. This demonstrates our constant need to label cultural groups and justify their investment in arrival into the United States. In 1902, Chinese immigration was permanently made illegal and was not repealed until 1943. From 1930 to 1940, the United States deports approximately 600,000 Mexicans, many of whom are United States citizens. Known as the Mexican Reparation, this mass deportation of Mexicans from the United States was purely based on race. Citizenship was not taken into account because an estimated 60% of the people deported were United States citizens. Many of the people who were deported to Mexico either had never been there or hadn't been in so long they had no connections and were forced to rebuild a life from scratch in an unfamiliar place. Mexicans were often unfairly blamed for the economic downturn that caused the Great Depression, and they were often targeted because of their distinct physical characteristics that set them apart from the white Americans. In 1944, the court case Korematsu v. United States rules that the exclusion order leading to Japanese American internment was not unconstitutional. In 1943, an executive order was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, and it ordered all people of Japanese ancestry to be moved off areas designated as military areas in surrounding communities in the United States. Those ordered to leave were relocated to detention camps. Fred Korematsu refused to leave his home and job despite the executive order. He had plastic surgery on his eyes to distinguish himself apart from his Japanese heritage. He also changed his name to Clyde Sarah and identified himself of Spanish and Hawaiian descent. About 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Korematsu was arrested for failure to report to a relocation center. The ACLU represented him, and he was found guilty of his charges and sent to a relocation center in California. His case was then appealed and brought to the Supreme Court. But in a 6-3 decision, it was decided that relocation to a detention camp was a military necessity, not based on race. Justice Robert Jackson referred to this ruling as the legalization of racism. In 2001, the U.S. Patriot Act is passed by Congress. Immediately following 9/11, President George W. Bush signed the USA Patriot Act, which gave the federal government the power to detail suspected terrorists for an unlimited time period without access to legal representation. This act changed the way the FBI operates regarding the war on terrorism. The Heritage Foundation conducted a report in 2012, and in their findings, since 9/11, 50 terrorist attacks have been discovered and prevented. The USA Patriot Act has been attributed to this success. The act was created essentially out of fear, and while racial profiling was already prevalent, post 9/11 made it more obvious and was targeted towards Muslims and even Middle Easterners as a collective. By analyzing all of these important moments regarding immigration, it becomes clear how Lopez illustrates the racial paradigm of colorblind white dominance. As stated previously, there were 3 elements to this paradigm. I want to conclude by focusing on the third as it relates to this timeline of racism and woven into the United States immigration policy. Lopez writes, "A colorblind ideology that simultaneously proclaims a robust commitment to anti-racism, yet works assiduously to prevent effective racial remediation. A predominant pattern that I have seen throughout my research is that in the majority of cases where exclusive action is being done to a minority group, there was a justification to combat claims that it was based on race. For example, in Korematsu versus United States, it is explicitly stated by the court that it is about safety. It is a military necessity and has no connection with race, even though the United States already has had a long history of exclusion against those with heritages from Asia. With the modern attitude, I don't see color, becoming more prevalent today, we must look back and study where this idea first originated. It's not a trendy mindset, and it's been occurring in not only our immigration policy, but our judicial system for years. Racial ideology is constantly changing, but white dominance has remained constant. The future of immigration and racism in the United States is dependent on the acknowledgement of these past decisions. It's dependent on recognizing who has been excluded in the past and not justifying it for the future.